Well, I'm here with Ralph Schoellhammer, and he has spoken very eloquently about many things on GB News, and he's here at ARC. What do you make of it?
Well, so far I have to say it's a very interesting event. Of course, the problem very often with these events is you bring together people who kind of share a majority of opinions already, but it's, I think, a good way to flesh out some of the ideas of what a new conservatism could look like. Now, I'm a continental European, as you can probably tell from my accent. It is very, which I like, but it's very Anglo-Saxon in its approach. So I would have, as a slight critique or as a recommendation, if they do it again, I think in February 2025, maybe look at some of the flavors of conservatism that exist, like in Eastern Europe, in Latin America. I think there are different approaches these days, what a future conservatism could look like. And so far we have a very good insight now what the Anglo-American approach is, but I think there are others we should also take a look at in the future.
So what sort of variants are there? I mean, it seems that we are mostly agreed as conservatives. A lot of people would agree that you can't separate sex from gender, and biology counts, and a man cannot be a woman, and all these things, which I consider are quite conservative approaches. How does that differ in other countries?
Well, for example, if you look to Eastern Europe, right? If you look to Poland, if you look to Hungary, I mean, there we have models where the government and the population are very much in sync when it comes to precisely what you described to these conservative values, and where the governments are really willing to execute conservative ideas. The problem we see in Britain a little bit is that I have to admit I see it a little bit here as well, and I saw it a couple of weeks ago. I didn't go there at the Conservative Party conference. Sometimes you have conservatives talking about conservatism as if they're not in government, and that's a little bit odd, right? It's kind of say, here is these are the values, this is what we have to do, and they say, all right, so you could do some of this, and it's not happening. And I think this is a little bit different in these Eastern European countries, where the governments go out and say, we have an ideological agenda, and we don't hide it as an ideological agenda, because they argue that, for example, whatever one thinks about it, that liberalism or left liberalism, if you want, is an ideology, and you need a counter ideology. I think this is a little bit the problem we also have in the debate here, is if you want to go up against something, or if you think something is wrong, it's not enough just to point out what's wrong with it. You also have to present what is your counter vision, and I think that's so much more difficult to say who you are than who you are against.
Well, and in defense of these conservatives that you speak of, they are the most unconservative conservatives that I've ever seen.
Well, if this is your defense, I don't want to know what your critic looks like.
So, I just, I don't know, the Conservative Party don't appear to be doing much conservative stuff.
I agree,
they're more like liberals in my view.
Indeed, I completely agree.
And those within it who are the conservatives are seen as the extremists, which is, I find, astonishing. But you have spoken very eloquently about the whole Israel-Hamas situation, and I'd like to hear, your view.
Well, I think there are two things we have to take into account. Like, one is the conflict in the region between Israel and Hamas. Like, for them, it's primarily about Israel and Hamas. But of course, what we also see is that this conflict has broader repercussions throughout the regions, and also within the West itself. Because two things that we have observed, to kind of begin with the region itself, what Hamas was trying to do, and I'm not sure if they're going to be successful with this, it was kind of to entirely derail the potential for Israel to become a recognized state within the Middle East. I mean, there is a secret nobody wants to talk about, that nobody wants to mention, which is the leadership of the Arab world is not a huge fan of Hamas. The leadership of Saudi Arabia is not happy with Hamas. The leadership of Egypt is not happy with Hamas. But of course, their populations see it differently. I always bring up this number, but I think it's a good number to highlight this. Saudi Arabia has made huge efforts to normalize relations with Israel. But they did a poll recently. Only 7% of the people of Saudi Arabia would allow an Israeli prime minister to visit their country. Right? So that's a very low bar to meet. But even that low bar they have a problem with. In Europe, on the other hand, what we see is there is, and I think that pertains to both the environmental movement, it pertains to the general left movement, to the universities, a very strong anti-Western ideology, which I think in the end multiculturalism truly is. It's an anti-Western ideology. And this is one of the reasons why they are so against Israel, because they see it as a Western outpost in the Middle East. So by default, they say those must be the bad guys.
I think you're being very generous to some of those people at those universities. I think you are, because I watched a lot of the footage about them, and they were having die-ins. So they were all pretending to be dead on the floor and pretending to be Palestinians, who are being killed in Gaza because of the Israeli bombing.
Yes.
But that wouldn't have happened had it not been for what happened on the 7th of October.
Oh, absolutely.
And I'm not saying that anyone should be killed. I'm just saying that Israel have a right to defend itself. I think that's perfectly reasonable.
No, and I think what you describe is so true, because the mask slipped. Right? Because this was really a moment, a watershed moment, in the sense where people had to take sides or felt obliged to take sides, and it was surprising which side they took. I mean, it's ironic if you look at it. Israel or even, anti-Semitism seems to be the one thing where all of a sudden you find Greta Thunberg and Andrew Tate on the same page. I mean, that should tell you something, right? If apparently one of the things, the weirdest ideas...
But she appeared to be pro-Palestine.
Yes, as Andrew Tate.
Is he really? I wouldn't have expected that.
He had a little bit of a Twitter gif with Ben Shapiro about this.
Really? I would have expected him not to be that. I don't know why. Just with his sheer misogyny, I thought that he might be looking at... Actually, no, I'm talking myself out of it. But Greta Thunberg, I think it's a surprise to me that she would be demonstrating a pro-Palestinian stance.
This is the thing, I'm not so sure if it's really a surprise, because this is what I meant, right? That all these different ideologies, whether it's multiculturalism or this radical environmentalism, that they are only, whether they do it consciously or subconsciously is a separate question. But for them, it is a kind of a resistance against the West. It's an anti-Western ideology. So by default, this is the position they take. And what's worrisome, again, that this pertains to this conference, is the conservative movement fights battles, the left fights a war. And I think this is what we don't understand. Like, they see this as a holistic thing, and they talk like this, right? They say, well, this is not just about the environment, it's about social justice, right? This is not just about Palestine, it's about global justice. Whereas on the right, very often it's about, this is about reducing emissions, this is about a two-state solution. And I think this is what we don't understand on the conservative side, that, as I said, we fight battles, they fight wars. And I think unless we get this, we'll always be at a disadvantage. Or to put it different, and this goes rightly to what you said before, the conservatives are sometimes in office, sometimes they're not in office, but the left is always in power because they control the cultural institutions, they control most of the media
Civil
institutions,
service.
they control the universities.
I was actually astonished at how much vitriol and how much aggression there was against the Jewish people, as it were. I mean, being black, I have experienced parts of racism, but it hasn't really fazed me that much, or been so much for me to think, wow. Yeah. But what I've observed is something that I would never have imagined, the level of barbarism that was involved in that particular attack on the 7th, and then the whole pro-Palestinian behaviour around it. Now, I know people of Palestine are not the same as Hamas, but it is very difficult to fully separate the two when Hamas are the governing organisation within there. So I was just shocked at how
it's shocking. And just a couple of months back, they did a poll in Palestine, in the Palestinian areas, and they were asking people, if there would be a two-state solution, would you still support the continuous fight against Israel until basically all of Israel disappears? And over 50% say yes. So exactly what you say, you cannot separate it. And I don't think so. This is, again, I think, in the West, we very often like to project our idea on somebody else. I mean, this bothers me so much, again, about multiculturalism. It's an ideology that absolves you from knowing anything about the other side. We saw this. This is, if a person goes with a rainbow flag to a Hamas protest, what that shows you is and either the person is insane, but I think what it really shows you, that person has no idea about the people that he or she thinks they are joining. And this is, multiculturalism is not just anti-Western, it's also the intellectually laziest of all ideologies. And this is, for me, always the reason why I'm against it.
Yeah, and I wrote a piece in the Daily Mail about it, saying that it has failed.
It has,
because the notion is that it would be pockets of individual sort of ghettoized communities that don't really speak to each other. Yeah. And it's not working. So what do you think is I know it's a big question, but in your view, what would you see as a solution?
I mean, if we figure this out right now,
that'd be great,
we can leave the table and go and pick up the Nobel Peace Prize. So, I mean, the solution is, and this is a brutal thing to say, but if you look historically, in order to defeat an ideology, you must humiliate it. I mean, fascism was not defeated because we had intellectual debates about the pros and cons of fascism, but they lost the war so devastatingly that people said, you know what, we can't do this ideology, which, by the way, never really happened to communism, which is why communism, at least in some pockets, is still popular. And I think the same thing is true with Islamism. We cannot do this to say, well, they're the really bad Islamists, the not so bad Islamists, and the kind of okay moderate Islamists. Like, we didn't do this with Nazism either, right? We didn't say, Hitler is really bad. but there's a bunch of Nazis who are really kind of acceptable. You need to humiliate the ideology so that people start to look for something else. And the problem is, if you look, for example, at pictures of university graduates from Algeria, from Egypt in the 1970s, right? Barely a woman was veiled, right? It was very Western. Afghanistan, Kabul, the same thing. And that has changed. Islamism still is the ideology that has most of the power in the region. In a sense, the governments there are putting a lid on it. So I think if there would be free elections in Saudi Arabia, free elections in Egypt, also free elections in the West Bank and Gaza, I think you would have more Islamism rather than less.
Really?
And we have to face this. This is, if we cannot offer those people, it's not just about economics, it's also about what to believe in, what is the meaning in life that they find. There must be an alternative, and unless there is none, I think this conflict will go on as long as it can, unfortunately.
So do you think, in a way, Israel is delusional in believing that if it does wipe out, or that even if it can wipe out Hamas, that will be the end of it?
I think what we would then, in the worst case scenario, but also the most likely scenario, we're going to end up with Hamas 2.0. Because these people, that's not their fault, but it's a fact we have to look at. They have been marinated in this belief, right? These are people that grew up with just learning to hate the Jews, to hate Israel, to kind of change this. What would have to be done, and this is probably going to be the most shocking thing, but as I said, we have to talk openly about this. After World War II, right, there was a deliberate attempt by the British, by the Americans, to re-educate the German population, right? They looked very closely, which books are you using in school? Like, kind of what is said on radio? Kind of what is written in newspapers? There was a denazification program. And at some point, you will need a de-Islamification problem. By the way, we cannot do this. We cannot do it in the Middle East. But look at what's happening in Britain. Like, we know now what's being taught, what's being preached in mosques, what's being taught in those schools. And how do you imagine those people think differently if we just say, we don't touch how you educate your children, but we expect them to become quote-unquote good Western liberals? Like, you have to start at the beginning. You cannot just expect the outcome.
That's the multiculturalism element, isn't it? Their little silo of Islam there alongside whatever we've got going here, and never the twain shall meet.
Exactly.
So we end up with...
In the end, what multiculturalism truly means is, I don't care what the other side does. And that is such a... In a sense, it's this bigotry of low expectations, right? They say, oh, these people come to us, but they have certain ideas, certain values, but who am I to change it? Well, if you truly believe in your own values, you want to change them. And this is what, again, we don't understand. If you are a young 15-year-old Muslim in Paris, in London, in Brussels, in Vienna, what do you think is attractive to you? Which culture seems to have a backbone? Which culture seems to have confidence? And I have to say, it's not Western liberalism.
No, it seems to be dying a death. It seems to be.
It is.
Already in this country, there are, 3 million people, Muslims in this country. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but how are we, what are we going to do in terms of when it comes to, say, Sir Keir Starmer, whose party, members of his party are resigning because they're not happy with his stance on Israel?
Yes, and let's be clear, as you said yourself, but based on your own experiences, Islam is not a race. Right? This is something, if we would say we want to change people's race, that would be, first of all, it's impossible, but that would be a different story. It's a belief, right? It's a culture. Of course you can change your culture. But it's like saying, oh, you're born a Muslim, there's nothing we can do. Of course you can. And we did this in the past, but and there's nothing wrong with saying, if you come to Britain, if you can't come to Europe, we would like you to adopt certain values. It doesn't mean you have to entirely drop your entire tradition, your entire heritage. But as we said, right, running through Vienna or Sydney yelling Hamas, Hamas, Jews to the gas, that is not going to work. So I think this is the limit you have to make. You can you are entitled to your own values, religion, beliefs to the level to which they are compatible with the new country you choose to make your home country. I don't think that's too much to ask.
Well, I think we've tied ourselves in knots because we say you're free to speak and free to do your own thing, but we want you to be saying this and being culturally this way when you come here.
Yes,
absolutely. I don't know what the answer is, Ralph, but it's very good to talk to you anyway.
Anytime.
Must get you on my show to talk more.
I hope so.
Thank you.